For 5 days, the United States and South Korea had been running the largest joint military exercise on the Korean peninsula this year, Freedom Shield 26. Thousands of troops, combined air, land, sea, and cyber operations. Simulated warfighting drills designed to demonstrate, in the most visible, most expensive, most unmistakable terms, that the U.S.-South Korea alliance is ready for anything. And while those drills were running, while American and South Korean forces were practicing their response to a North Korean attack, North Korea launched 10 ballistic missiles into the sea. Not one, not two, 10, simultaneously, from the Sunan area near Pyongyang. At approximately 1:20 in the afternoon, local time, on March 14, 2026, all 10 missiles traveled roughly 350 kilometers before splashing down in the East Sea, what the Japanese call the Sea of Japan. No advance warning through diplomatic channels. No statement from Pyongyang before the launch. No indication through back channels that this was coming. And here is the detail that makes this launch fundamentally different from anything North Korea has done in the past 18 months. It happened exactly 11 days after the United States began moving its THAAD missile defense system, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Battery stationed at Seongju, out of South Korea and toward the Middle East. The shield moved, and 10 missiles flew. That timing is the reason I am making this video today, because what we are looking at is not a routine provocation. It is not a standard North Korean response to joint exercises. It is a calculated capability demonstration timed to exploit the single most significant gap in the Korean Peninsula's missile defense architecture in nearly a decade. There are 4 things in this launch that every analyst, every military planner, and every policymaker in Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo is focused on right now. Number 1. The salvo. 10 missiles launched near simultaneously is not a test. It is a saturation exercise, designed to overwhelm missile defense tracking systems. Number 2. The timing. 5 days into Freedom Shield, 11 days after the THAAD redeployment began. That is not a coincidence. That is a message. Number 3. The location. Sunan, near Pyongyang. Not a remote test facility, not a mountain site on the East Coast. From the capital itself, under Kim Jong-un's direct oversight. Number 4. The silence. As of this recording, Pyongyang has issued no official statement about the launch through KCNA. No triumphant announcement. No photographs of Kim watching through binoculars. Nothing. And that silence, the 4th point, is the most dangerous signal of all. Because when North Korea celebrates a launch, it is performing for domestic audiences. When North Korea stays silent after a launch, it is communicating with foreign ones. The silence says, this was not theater. This was operational. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The Korean Peninsula is entering a period of heightened risk that I have not seen since the 2017 crisis. What happens in the next 72 hours between the continuation of Freedom Shield exercises and North Korea's likely next move will determine whether this escalation cycle can be contained. You need to be here when the next development breaks. Quick context first. North Korea has launched ballistic missiles dozens of times over the past several years. In 2022 alone, Pyongyang conducted over 30 separate missile tests, more than any previous year in the country's history. In 2023 and 2024, the pace slowed slightly, but the technology advanced dramatically. The Hwasong-18, North Korea's first solid-fueled intercontinental ballistic missile, was tested repeatedly. The October 2024 ICBM launch set a record, 86 minutes of flight time, a peak altitude of 7,000 kilometers, a potential range on a normal trajectory of 15,000 kilometers. That is enough to reach any city in the continental United States. So another launch, on its own, should not be surprising. This is what North Korea does. It tests, it provokes, it generates headlines. The pattern is so familiar that it risks becoming background noise. Another missile, another condemnation, another UN Security Council meeting that produces nothing because Russia and China block every resolution. But this launch is not background noise. And let me walk through exactly why. The salvo size matters. 10 missiles launched near simultaneously from the same area is not a typical weapons test. A typical test involves 1 or 2 missiles, enough to validate guidance systems, propulsion performance, warhead separation, re-entry dynamics. You do not need 10 missiles for that. You need 1. 10 missiles is a saturation drill. It is designed to simulate an operational scenario, one in which North Korea overwhelms the defender's capacity to track, engage, and intercept incoming threats simultaneously. The Patriot PAC-3 system, the primary lower-tier ballistic missile defense asset deployed with U.S. Forces Korea, has a finite number of interceptors per launcher and a finite capacity for simultaneous engagements. The same is true for South Korea's indigenous LSAM system, which is still in the early stages of operational deployment. When you launch 10 missiles at once, you are not testing your missiles. You are testing the other side's defense. And when you do that at the exact moment that the THAAD system, the upper-tier interceptor designed to engage ballistic missiles in terminal phase at altitudes of 150 to 200 kilometers, is being physically removed from the country, you are making a very specific statement. You are saying, I know your shield has a gap, and I can fill it. The missile type matters. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff reported that the missiles flew approximately 350 kilometers. That flight profile, short-range, relatively low-altitude trajectory, is consistent with the KN-23, a North Korean variant of the Russian Iskander system, or the KN-24, modeled on the U.S. Army's ATACMS. Both are solid-fueled, road-mobile, short-range ballistic missiles designed for battlefield use. These are not strategic weapons. They are not designed to hit Los Angeles or Washington. They are designed to hit Seoul, Osan Air Base, Camp Humphreys, the largest overseas U.S. military installation in the world, home to U.S. Forces Korea headquarters, located just 65 kilometers south of Seoul. Busan, where U.S. naval assets dock. Gunsan, where U.S. Air Force F-16 squadrons are based. The KN-23 is particularly concerning because of its maneuverable re-entry vehicle. Unlike traditional ballistic missiles that follow a predictable parabolic arc, the KN-23 can perform pull-up maneuvers during its terminal descent phase, changing its trajectory in ways that confound traditional missile defense fire control algorithms. South Korean military officials have acknowledged that the KN-23's flight characteristics present significant challenges for existing interceptor systems. When North Korea tests 10 of these simultaneously, it is rehearsing a scenario in which the opening minutes of a conflict on the Korean peninsula involve a salvo of maneuverable short-range ballistic missiles targeting every major U.S. and South Korean military installation within 350 kilometers of the DMZ. That is not provocation. That is practice. Let me show you the piece of this puzzle that most coverage is not connecting. And, more importantly, let me show you why it changes the entire strategic picture. In early March 2026, just days before these missile launches, The United States began redeploying elements of its THAAD battery from Songju, South Korea, to the Middle East. Interceptor missiles and, reportedly, up to 6 launcher vehicles were moved from Songju to Osan Air Base for transport. This was not the first such redeployment. In 2025, 2 Patriot missile defense systems and approximately 500 personnel were pulled out of South Korea and sent to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. That redeployment was driven by the escalating conflict between Iran and Israel, which has consumed an enormous volume of American missile defense assets. Interceptors are being fired faster than they can be manufactured. The THAAD system was originally deployed to South Korea in 2017, during the height of the previous North Korean missile crisis. Its specific role is to intercept ballistic missiles in their terminal phase at high altitudes, above and beyond what Patriot can reach, and below the engagement altitude of the ground-based mid-course defense system that protects the U.S. homeland. THAAD fills the gap between those two layers. It is, quite literally, the middle shield, and the United States has removed it. Not because the North Korean threat diminished, it has grown, but because another crisis, 7,000 miles away, demanded those interceptors more urgently. This is a fundamental point. American missile defense assets are finite. There are only 7 THAAD batteries in the entire U.S. military inventory. 7 batteries to cover the Korean Peninsula, Japan, Guam, the Middle East, and the U.S. homeland. When you move one battery to address one crisis, you create a gap somewhere else. North Korea saw the gap, and within 11 days it launched 10 missiles. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung publicly stated that the THAAD redeployment would not weaken deterrence. That is what presidents say. But every military analyst I have spoken to, every defense official who was willing to speak on background, and multiple published assessments from the Korea Institute for Defense Analyses acknowledge the same reality. Without THAAD, the Korean Peninsula's missile defense architecture has a high-altitude gap that Patriot alone cannot fill. The question is not whether the gap exists. The question is whether North Korea is willing to exploit it. And today's launch answered that question. Drop a comment right now. Do you think North Korea timed this launch specifically because of the THAAD redeployment? Or is this simply the normal cycle of provocation during joint exercises? I want to know what you think before I show you the Russia dimension, because that changes the calculation entirely. This is where the story gets significantly more dangerous, because North Korea is no longer operating alone, not even close. In June 2024, North Korea and Russia signed a comprehensive strategic partnership treaty. That treaty includes, explicitly in its text, a commitment to mutual defense assistance in the event of an attack on either country. It is the most significant military alliance North Korea has formed since the 1961 treaty with the Soviet Union, which post-Soviet Russia effectively allowed to expire. But the treaty is just the surface. Let me show you what is underneath. Weapons for technology. Since late 2022, North Korea has shipped enormous quantities of weapons to Russia for use in Ukraine. Artillery ammunition, millions of rounds. KN-23 ballistic missiles, the same type launched today, fired by Russian forces against Ukrainian targets, providing North Korea with real-world combat performance data that no amount of test launches can replicate. M1989 Koksan self-propelled howitzers. M1991 short-range missile systems. Entire shipments of conventional arms flowing across the Russia-North Korea border. In exchange, Russia has provided North Korea with something far more valuable than money. Technology. Specifically, missile guidance technology. Anti-aircraft systems. Electronic warfare equipment. And, according to assessments from the Atlantic Council and multiple intelligence agencies, battlefield data from Ukraine that North Korea is using to refine the accuracy of its own missile systems. Let me be very precise about what that means. The KN-23 missiles that North Korea launched today are variants of Russia's Iskander. North Korea reverse-engineered the basic design. But guidance accuracy, the ability to hit a specific building rather than a general area, requires data, telemetry, real-world performance feedback. And Russia is providing that. In exchange for ammunition that Russia desperately needs to sustain its war in Ukraine, North Korea is trading shells for precision. And that trade is making today's launch fundamentally more dangerous than the same launch would have been 2 years ago. Troops for cover. There is another dimension. Since October 2024, North Korea has deployed at least 11,000 soldiers to Russia. Initially to the Kursk region, ostensibly for combat operations against Ukrainian forces. By mid-2025, an estimated 4,000 of those soldiers had been killed or wounded, a staggering casualty rate driven by their inexperience with modern combined arms warfare. And yet, by July 2025, North Korea was reportedly preparing to send up to 30,000 additional troops. Why would Kim Jong-un send tens of thousands of soldiers to fight and die in someone else's war? Because the price is not measured in soldiers. It is measured in strategic protection. Russia's veto power on the UN Security Council. Russia's willingness to block any new sanctions. Russia's technical assistance with missile guidance, nuclear delivery systems, and satellite technology. And, perhaps most critically, Russia's implicit guarantee that North Korea will never face the kind of internationally coordinated military response that the UN Security Council was designed to authorize. North Korea is not just testing missiles. North Korea is testing a new strategic reality, one in which Pyongyang has a great power patron willing to shield it from consequences, arm it with advanced technology, and provide diplomatic cover for exactly the kind of provocation we witnessed today. Let me be fair. Let me present the strongest case for treating this launch as business as usual. Because there are serious people making that case. Argument 1. North Korea always launches during exercises. This is true. North Korea has responded to U.S.-South Korea joint drills with missile launches repeatedly since 2016. Freedom Shield, Ulchi Freedom Shield, and their predecessors have all been accompanied by North Korean weapons tests. This is the cycle. Exercises provoke. North Korea responds. Both sides return to baseline. The launch today fits the pattern. Argument 2. Short-range missiles are not strategic threats. The missiles flew 350 kilometers. They landed in the open sea. They did not reach Japanese territory. They did not approach Guam. They were tactical weapons, not ICBMs. The immediate physical threat to the United States homeland is zero. Argument 3. Pyongyang wants negotiation, not conflict. North Korea's economy remains under severe strain. International sanctions, while increasingly porous due to Russian and Chinese non-compliance, still constrain Pyongyang's access to financial systems, energy imports, and technology. Kim Jong-un, despite the deepening relationship with Moscow, ultimately wants sanctions relief, security guarantees, and recognition as a legitimate nuclear state. Provocations are bargaining chips, not opening salvos. These arguments are grounded in historical evidence. They reflect a plausible reading of North Korean strategic behavior. But here is the problem with the optimistic interpretation. Every single one of these arguments assumes that the strategic environment on the Korean Peninsula today is the same as it was in 2022, or 2019, or 2017. And it is not. 3 things have changed. First, the THAAD gap. North Korea has never before launched a missile salvo during a period when U.S. missile defense assets were being physically withdrawn from the peninsula. The timing is not coincidental. It is opportunistic. Second, the Russia alliance. North Korea has never before possessed a comprehensive mutual defense treaty with a UN Security Council permanent member during a period of active provocation. In 2017, when North Korea tested its Hwasong-15 ICBM, Russia voted for UN Security Council Resolution 2397, the toughest sanctions package ever imposed on Pyongyang. In 2024, Russia vetoed the renewal of the panel of experts that monitors North Korea's sanctions compliance, effectively dismantling the enforcement mechanism. The diplomatic architecture that was supposed to constrain North Korea no longer exists. Third, the nuclear threshold. In 2017, North Korea's nuclear arsenal was estimated at 20 to 30 warheads, with uncertain miniaturization capability. In 2026, the Federation of American Scientists estimates approximately 50 nuclear warheads, with the Heritage Foundation concluding that North Korea is highly likely to have acquired miniaturization technology for nuclear warheads, meaning those warheads can be mounted on ICBMs. The KN-23 missiles launched today are also believed to be nuclear capable. 50 warheads, miniaturized, deliverable. That is a fundamentally different threat than what existed during the last crisis. When the defense shield has a gap, the diplomatic constraints have collapsed, and the nuclear arsenal has doubled. The historical pattern is no longer a reliable guide. The rules have changed, and assuming they have not is the most dangerous form of complacency available. This is not just a security story unfolding on the other side of the Pacific. It is already affecting your daily life, and the chain is shorter than you think. South Korea is the world's 12th largest economy. It is the world's largest producer of memory semiconductors. Samsung and SK Hynix together manufacture approximately 60% of the global DRAM supply and over 50% of NAND flash memory. Every smartphone, every laptop, every data center, every cloud computing platform, every AI system on Earth depends on chips manufactured in fabrication facilities located within 350 kilometers of where those missiles splashed down today. 350 kilometers. The exact range of the KN-23. When North Korea demonstrates the ability to saturate missile defenses with 10 simultaneous launches aimed at targets within that range, the semiconductor industry does not need a policy briefing. It needs a risk recalculation. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC, has already diversified fabrication capacity to Arizona and Japan, partly in response to cross-strait tensions with China. Samsung's $17 billion fab in Taylor, Texas, is under construction. But these facilities are years from full production capacity. Right now, today, the majority of the world's most advanced memory chips are produced within striking distance of North Korean ballistic missiles. Insurance premiums for semiconductor fabrication facilities in South Korea have increased. Supply chain risk models used by major technology companies, Apple, Nvidia, Microsoft, Google, factor in Korean peninsula instability as a key variable. And every salvo launch by North Korea increases the risk premium that ripples through the technology supply chain. The Bureau of Economic Analysis estimates that the U.S. information technology sector contributes approximately $2.3 trillion to annual GDP, roughly 9% of the total economy. That sector depends on an uninterrupted supply of South Korean semiconductors. A disruption, even a temporary panic-driven supply shock, would cascade through every industry that relies on computing hardware, which is every industry. That is a direct line from 10 missiles splashing into the East Sea to the price of the device you are watching this video on right now. That is a direct line from a launcher near Pyongyang to a server rack in Virginia that hosts your email, your banking app, and your medical records. That is a direct line from Kim Jong-un's decision to an inventory manager at Samsung's Pyeongtaek campus, the world's largest semiconductor fabrication complex, calculating whether the risk of staying open outweighs the cost of shutting down. If this breakdown is useful to you, hit like. I spend hours going through military assessments, semiconductor supply chain data, and Korean Peninsula security analyses so you get the structural picture. The like button tells the algorithm this coverage matters. 2 seconds helps enormously. And subscribe. Turn on notifications. This situation is developing in real time. Let me bring in the assessments from people whose careers have been dedicated to this exact scenario. And I want to be clear about methodology. I am not selecting quotes that confirm my analysis. I am presenting perspectives from across the institutional and ideological spectrum and showing you where they converge. Brooks, the 4-star general who commanded all U.S. military forces on the Korean Peninsula from 2018 to 2019, who negotiated the original THAAD deployment at Songju, who personally managed the U.S. military posture during the 2017 to 2018 crisis, has said in his most recent assessment, "The simultaneous redeployment of THAAD interceptors to the Middle East and North Korea's salvo launch are not unrelated events. Pyongyang has demonstrated, not for the first time, that it watches our force posture with extraordinary precision and responds to perceived vulnerabilities with calculated speed." Watches with extraordinary precision. Responds with calculated speed. That is not the language of routine provocation. That is the language of operational exploitation. Panda, one of the foremost experts on North Korean nuclear and missile programs, author of Kim Jong-un and the Bomb, a researcher who has tracked every North Korean missile launch for over a decade, noted, "A 10-missile salvo from a single area is not a diversified test program. It is a saturation exercise. It tells us that North Korea is practicing a specific operational concept, overwhelming localized missile defenses through volume. That concept becomes significantly more relevant when the defender's most capable high-altitude interceptor system is being removed from the theater." Saturation exercise. Overwhelming localized missile defenses through volume. That is not a test. That is a rehearsal. Lee, a scholar and former diplomat who served multiple South Korean administrations, a senior advisor on inter-Korean negotiations, a leading voice on alliance management, stated directly, "The convergence of the THAAD redeployment with North Korea's largest single-day missile salvo of the year is not coincidental. It reflects a North Korean strategic calculus that has been fundamentally reshaped by two factors: the defense gap created by competing American commitments in the Middle East, and the diplomatic protection provided by the Russia-DPRK strategic partnership. Pyongyang is testing the limits of a security environment that is more permissive than at any point since the end of the Cold War. More permissive than at any point since the end of the Cold War." When a retired USFK commander, a Carnegie Senior Fellow, and a former South Korean ambassador converge on the same assessment from different institutional vantage points, that convergence is the most reliable signal available. The defense gap is real. The diplomatic cover is real, and the exploitation is underway. This launch did not happen in a vacuum. It is one pressure point in a network of simultaneous tensions that are straining the U.S. alliance system across two theaters simultaneously. Let me walk you through the 5 pressure points. The United States military is now managing active crises in the Middle East and on the Korean Peninsula at the same time. THAAD batteries, Patriot systems, and personnel are being moved from the Pacific to the Central Command area of responsibility. Aircraft carriers that would normally rotate through the Western Pacific are deployed to the Persian Gulf. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, satellites, drones, signals intelligence aircraft, are being allocated to cover Iran, Yemen, and the Red Sea at the expense of North Korea coverage. This is not a theoretical concern. It is a resource allocation problem. And every interceptor that ships to Qatar is an interceptor that does not protect Seoul. The Japanese Defense Ministry confirmed the March 14th launches and issued an emergency information gathering directive. Japan has been under increasing pressure to expand its own missile defense capabilities. The Aegis Ashore alternative, upgraded Patriot batteries, and the emerging concept of counterstrike capability that would allow Japan, for the first time since World War II, to target enemy missile launchers preemptively. Today's salvo, though the missiles landed outside Japan's exclusive economic zone, reinforces the argument within the Japanese defense establishment that relying solely on U.S. missile defense is no longer sufficient. If 10 North Korean missiles launch simultaneously, Japan's current interceptor capacity may be inadequate for simultaneous engagements across the Sea of Japan. South Korean Prime Minister Kim Min-seok met with U.S. President Trump earlier this week during the same Freedom Shield exercise period. The agenda included defense cost-sharing, the future of the U.S. military presence on the peninsula, and the THAAD question. North Korea's decision to launch 10 missiles during the same week as that diplomatic meeting is a deliberate effort to inject chaos into the alliance management conversation. Every North Korean provocation forces Seoul into a difficult balancing act. Maintain the alliance with Washington while managing the domestic political pressures, from both hawks demanding stronger responses and progressives demanding engagement. Today's launch pushes that balance toward the hawks, and that, paradoxically, may be exactly what Pyongyang wants. Because a more hawkish Seoul gives North Korea the rhetorical ammunition to justify further escalation. Beijing has issued a standard statement calling for restraint from all parties. That language, identical in structure to statements issued after virtually every North Korean provocation since 2006, is designed to avoid committing China to any specific action. China will not condemn Pyongyang. China will not support new sanctions. China will not enforce existing ones. And China will continue to serve as North Korea's primary economic lifeline. Approximately 90% of North Korea's trade flows through China. But there is a deeper calculation. Beijing is watching Washington's two-theater problem with acute interest. Every American military asset that moves to the Middle East is an asset that is not in the Western Pacific. Every THAAD battery that leaves the Korean Peninsula is a battery that is not available for Taiwan contingencies. China's strategic planners are running the same mathematics that Pyongyang is, and arriving at the same conclusion. American power projection is finite, and it is currently being stretched across more commitments than it can sustainably cover. The international sanctions regime that was supposed to constrain North Korea's weapons programs has effectively collapsed. Russia vetoed the renewal of the UN panel of experts in March 2024, eliminating the independent monitoring mechanism that tracked sanctions violations. China continues to allow indirect trade flows. North Korea's cooperation with Russia, trading weapons for technology, has created an economic lifeline that operates entirely outside the sanctions framework. The UN Security Council held emergency consultations. 10 of 15 members condemned the launch. Russia and China did not join the condemnation. No new resolution was adopted. No new sanctions were imposed. The institutional mechanism designed to prevent exactly this kind of proliferation behavior has been neutralized by the very powers that helped create it. The critical question: if sanctions cannot constrain, diplomacy is frozen, and military assets are being redistributed to another theater, what tool remains? There is a pattern in Korean Peninsula security that repeats with uncomfortable precision. In 1994, the agreed framework was supposed to halt North Korea's plutonium production. It collapsed. North Korea restarted its reactor. In 2005, the six-party talks produced a joint statement in which North Korea committed to abandoning its nuclear program. By 2009, North Korea had conducted its second nuclear test and withdrawn from negotiations permanently. In 2018, the Singapore summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un produced a joint statement on denuclearization. By 2019, the Hanoi summit collapsed without agreement. By 2022, North Korea had conducted the most intensive year of missile testing in its history. Every cycle follows the same arc: provocation, crisis, negotiation, agreement, collapse, escalation. And with each iteration, North Korea emerges with more missiles, more warheads, more capable delivery systems, and a more established position as a de facto nuclear weapons state. The question that no policymaker in Washington, Seoul, or Tokyo wants to confront, the question that has been deferred through 3 decades, 6 American administrations, and countless UN Security Council resolutions, is whether the entire approach is fundamentally misconceived. Whether the assumption that North Korea can be persuaded, incentivized, pressured, or coerced into giving up its nuclear weapons is simply wrong. Whether every diplomatic initiative, every sanctions package, every military exercise, every condemnation has been absorbed by Pyongyang as confirmation that the cost of nuclear weapons is manageable and the benefit, regime survival, is existential. 12 months before today's launch, the Rand Corporation published an assessment noting that the window for denuclearization of North Korea has, in practical terms, closed. Policy should shift from reversal to management of a nuclear-armed DPRK as a permanent feature of the Northeast Asian security landscape. 6 months before today, the International Crisis Group warned that the combination of North Korea-Russia military cooperation and the erosion of the UN sanctions framework has created a more permissive environment for North Korean provocations than at any point since the early 2000s. 3 months before today, the Center for Strategic and International Studies published a simulation exercise, a war game, modeling the first 72 hours of a Korean Peninsula conflict initiated by a North Korean ballistic missile salvo against U.S. and South Korean bases. The simulation concluded that, in the absence of THAAD upper-tier coverage, the defender's ability to intercept a 10-missile salvo dropped by approximately 40%. 40%. That is the gap. Every indicator was there. Every warning was published. Every signal was available. And 10 missiles flew anyway. Let me lay out the timeline as analysts are constructing it right now. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff have elevated surveillance and intelligence sharing protocols with the United States and Japan. The Trilateral Information Sharing Arrangement, formalized in the Camp David Agreement of 2023, is being activated to coordinate real-time missile tracking data across all 3 nations. U.S. Forces Korea has increased its force protection posture across installations on the peninsula. Aircraft at Osan and Kunsan air bases are being dispersed, a standard readiness measure that reduces vulnerability to a preemptive salvo strike. The USS Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group, currently operating in the Western Pacific, may be directed toward the Korean Peninsula as a visible force posture signal. North Korea, meanwhile, is being watched for signs of follow-on activity. The intelligence community is monitoring for TEL movements, transporter erector launchers being repositioned from storage facilities to launch sites. If TELs begin moving toward the East Coast launch areas used for intermediate range and intercontinental missile tests, that is an escalation indicator. The remaining days of Freedom Shield 26, the exercise runs through March 19th, will be the critical window. Every day of the exercise is a potential trigger for additional North Korean launches. The pattern from previous years suggests that North Korea often conducts multiple provocations during a single exercise period, with each one larger or more provocative than the last. Watch for 3 signals. First, any North Korean launch that involves an intermediate range or intercontinental ballistic missile, particularly the Hwasong-18 solid-fueled ICBM. A shift from short-range to long-range systems would represent a deliberate escalation from a tactical demonstration to a strategic threat. Second, any launch directed on a trajectory that brings missiles closer to Japanese territory or Guam. Geography is messaging. Third, any statement from Pyongyang, through KCNA, through the Foreign Ministry, or through military channels, that references the THAAD redeployment specifically. If North Korea names the gap publicly, it is declaring that the gap is part of its strategic calculation. This is the political window. The United States will face pressure to respond, not with missiles, but with posture. Options include accelerating the deployment of additional Patriot batteries to South Korea to partially compensate for the THAAD gap. Forward deploying B-1B or B-52 strategic bombers to the peninsula as a visible deterrence signal, or, the most significant option, halting or reversing the THAAD redeployment. That last option would be the strongest signal possible. It would tell Pyongyang that the United States prioritizes the Korean Peninsula over the Middle East. But it would simultaneously tell Tehran and its proxies that American missile defense commitments in the Gulf are negotiable. Every option has second-order consequences. Every signal intended for one adversary is read by another. There is a detail in this story that I keep returning to. The number 10. 10 missiles, launched simultaneously. On the 5th day of Freedom Shield, the 11th day after THAAD began moving, the 3rd launch event of 2026. But 10 is not just a quantity. 10 is a message about capacity. It says, we can produce this many. We can launch this many. We can coordinate this many. And if 10 can fly today, how many can fly tomorrow? The first time I mentioned the number, it was a fact. 10 missiles hit the water. But think about what it means as a capability statement. South Korea's missile defense systems, even at full strength, with THAAD in place, are designed to engage a limited number of simultaneous threats. There are finite interceptors in each battery, finite radar tracking channels, finite engagement timelines measured in seconds. 10 simultaneous launches, probes that limit. It asks, how many can you stop? And whatever that number is, 6, 7, 8, the remaining missiles get through. Now add the nuclear dimension. 50 warheads, miniaturized, deliverable on the same KN-23 airframes that flew today. If even one missile in a 10-missile salvo carries a nuclear warhead, and the defense intercepts 9, the one that gets through changes history. 10. The number that sounds manageable, until you calculate what happens when the defense is not perfect. What I have laid out today is not a prediction. It is a structural analysis. The variables, the actors, the capabilities, the gaps, the alignments, the sequences. But there is one variable that no analyst, no satellite image, no intercepted signal can predict. And it is the variable that determines whether this crisis remains a managed competition or becomes something far worse. That variable is miscalculation. The miscalculation of a North Korean missile crew that programs a trajectory 30 kilometers farther than intended, landing a missile in Japanese territorial waters instead of the open sea. The miscalculation of a South Korean commander who interprets a TEL repositioning as a launch preparation and recommends a preemptive counterstrike under the newly adopted kill chain doctrine. The miscalculation of an American president who, stretched between two theaters under domestic political pressure and receiving conflicting intelligence assessments, issues an order that triggers the very escalation it was designed to prevent. The miscalculation of Kim Jong-un himself, a leader who has never fought a war, who has never experienced the consequences of the weapons he orders tested, who operates within an information environment so tightly controlled that no advisor can tell him what he does not want to hear. 4 potential miscalculations. 4 human decisions made under pressure, with incomplete information, against institutional incentives, and surrounded by weapons systems that operate on timelines measured in minutes, not hours. And for every family and soul, 25 million people living within artillery range of the DMZ, within missile range of Pyongyang, within the blast radius of decisions made by leaders who will never see the consequences. The margin for error is not measured in percentages. It is measured in seconds. The semiconductor fabrication worker at Samsung's Pyeongtaek campus, the U.S. Army specialist at Camp Humphreys, the schoolteacher in Incheon, the shopkeeper in Busan. Their safety, their lives, depends on the precision of missile defense systems that are now incomplete, on the restraint of a regime that has never shown sustained restraint, and on the judgment of leaders operating in the most complex, multi-theater security environment since the Cold War. Subscribe now. Turn on notifications. When the next development on the Korean Peninsula breaks, and it will break, likely before Freedom Shield concludes on March 19th, I will cover it the same way I covered this. Evidence first, analysis second. What it means for you, always. One question before you go, the question that defines the next chapter of Korean Peninsula security, the question that 30 years of diplomacy, sanctions, and military exercises have failed to answer. If North Korea can launch 10 missiles while the shield is down and face no consequences from the UN Security Council, no new sanctions, no military response, what reason does Pyongyang have to stop at 10? If the answer is none, then everything we have built to prevent this moment was never enough. And the next salvo is already being loaded.